Fortress architecture was always part of a duel between attack and defense.
One Welsh castle had a garrison of 11 and successfully defended itself against the armies of Owain Glyndŵr.
Heroic accounts of castles very often see them solely in terms of being defensive, but in fact they were very, very aggressive institutions.
The Royal Armouries has moved most of its famous collection from the Tower of London to a specially built museum in Leeds in the north of England. The new museum displays one of the greatest collections of arms and armour in the world. The master of the Royal Armouries is Guy Wilson.
It's a basic human instinct to defend the place where we live, and so we've been fortifying our villages and towns for much of our history. And for just as long, there have been attacks upon these defences. For tens of thousands of years, much human thought and ingenuity has gone into trying to create impregnable fortifications. But this has proved impossible. Impossible because with every improvement in defences, new ways have been found of getting over them, under them, or through them. The invention of gunpowder proved a decisive turning point in this story, for big guns could easily defeat the stone walls of earlier fortifications. Or could they? Is this popular view really true? Or were the fortifications of earlier times stronger and more sophisticated than many of us think?
From the earliest times, the unprotected, the weak, and the young have always been at the mercy of violent raiders. Bands of men would attack peaceful settlements with no regard for human suffering. They killed for scraps of food and all the booty they could take with them. The old and useless were massacred, crops destroyed, and the young and the women were carried off. No one and nothing was spared. And anything that was left was burned. There were tens of thousands of these bloody and lawless years. When attackers overcame the first simple barriers, they forced defenders to rethink, so beginning the story of attack and defense that continues to this day. This remarkable British fortification, Maiden Castle, was begun nearly 5,000 years ago. Seen from the air, it may look useless as a protection against attack. It appears as a random succession of earth banks and ditches surrounding a large enclosure. But in fact, the design is a very sophisticated defense. The banks are 60 foot high in places. The entrances were planned to confuse the attacker who could never see where he was. From the defended tops of the earth banks, slingshot would rain down on the enemy. Only the legions of Imperial Rome managed to smash through the defenses at Maiden using their destructive siege machines. But once it was captured and the garrison slaughtered, the Romans lost interest and abandoned Maiden Castle. They needed to build their own forts in strategic positions to supply and arm the large numbers of soldiers necessary to keep the tribes of Britain under control. The Roman legions were not protecting innocent British villages. Their fortifications were instruments of imperial domination. In the 350 years the Romans occupied Britain, they built an extraordinary legacy of fortifications, many still visible today. Their most impressive contribution to Britain's landscape still survives. This is a masterpiece of Roman engineering and organizational skills. The Roman Emperor Hadrian ordered the wall to be built in 122 AD. It took 14 years to build. It marked the end of the empire and of civilization as the Romans knew it. There were only wild barbarians and barren uplands beyond the wall, and the wall, 73 miles long, built with earth and stone and 15 feet high, stretched between the east and west coasts of northern Britain. Large garrisons were needed to cope with frequent raids from the local tribes. Roman forts were built to a standardized rectangular shape, a shape that is still plainly visible in fortifications which were reused. Portchester Castle was originally built to protect the Roman imperial fleet at Portsmouth. It failed, but after the Romans abandoned Britain to its dark ages around 400 AD, the triumphant barbarians took over the empty site. When the Normans invaded in the 11th century, they also developed strategic Roman sites like these, giving themselves prestigious homes to reflect their new dominance. And Portchester became the home of nobility and even royalty. 2 English kings had close connections with this castle. Knights in shining armor parading on horseback before an impressive medieval castle is an enduring image.
For centuries, the castle was a potent symbol of royal or noble authority. But above all, it represented military strength. Indeed, for much of history, there was a balance, a constant balance, between attack and defense. As defense got stronger, so the attacker would make new weapons. As the new weapons arrived, so the defender would get new defenses.
But the knowledge and skills to build strong castles like these was brought to Britain by invaders from France, who conquered Britain in 1066, and who would stamp their own mark on British fortress architecture. Corfe Castle was built by William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who had defeated the English at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Before the conquest, there had been some wooden fortified manor houses to protect powerful lords. The conquering Norman lords built numerous castles high and strategically to control and dominate as much of the countryside as possible. Today we see huge numbers of stone castles like this famous royal one, but originally they were built quickly to control the defeated Anglo-Saxons, and they were made of wood. Many later stone castles were based on this standard Norman design. The tower in the center, the keep, remained the fortified home of the lord. The earliest Norman castles had a wooden keep in the center, surrounded by a walled enclosure known as a bailey. The keep sat on top of a simple earth mound to make it more secure. Around the protection of the castle's walls, small villages and towns evolved. The lord and his mounted knights lived inside, ready to emerge and surprise any passing army and its supply train.
Heroic accounts of castles very often see them solely in terms of being defensive and people subjected to sieges, but in fact they were very, very aggressive institutions, and large areas of the country could be controlled from them.
By the 13th century, hundreds of strong stone castles had been built, a tribute to the Normans' efficient control over most of the country. The keep became a bigger, squarer, and more solid tower, the strongest part of the castle. But it still retained its role as the lord's residence. To live in a castle, you needed to be able to get into it and out of it. But openings in the walls made the stronghold vulnerable, so doors and gates were specially protected from attack.
One of the simplest ways of closing the gate was by means of this heavy wooden grid called a portcullis, which could be dropped down very quickly to seal the gateway. Being heavy, it required a substantial piece of machinery above in order to lift it.
Ingenious and effective, the wooden portcullis was reinforced with iron and equipped with murderous spikes. With the portcullis down and the drawbridge up, a castle was very secure. But there is a little-known reason why this was very important and why fortifications had to be so tightly sealed.
In the normal course of events, a castle was very, very lightly defended. In fact, even a major castle like the Tower of London, as late as the 16th century, the accounts recall that there were only 4 or 5 yeoman warders manning the gates at night, which is a tiny number of people when you consider the castle covered many acres.
Money spent on sophisticated defences reduced the need for large garrisons. Caerphilly Castle in Wales had a complex design that used inner and outer rings of defences. The inner walls were higher, so they dominated the outer walls and could be successfully defended if these were taken. The outer walls were low and backed by earth to resist siege engines. Both rings of walls were built close together to present the attacker with a formidable challenge. The wide moat kept siege machines at a safe distance and ensured no one could mine or try and tunnel their way into the castle.
When it was built, this castle was at the forefront of military technology. For the first time in Britain, all the advances in castle building were brought together to create an interlinked and interlocking and integrated defensive system where every part of the castle helped to defend every other part.
Built in only 3 years in the late 13th century to subdue the local Welsh population, Caerphilly Castle, unlike earlier castles, has no high central stone keep. This had been abandoned in favour of a series of concentric walls from which archers can shoot, but in a way that has only recently been fully understood.
What you often see in medieval manuscripts is illustrations of defenders of castles leaning out over the walls and shooting down at the attackers at the base of the walls. But here that isn't possible because the wall's too thick and I can't get over to use my weapons. Even if I could, this is too narrow to allow me to put a crossbow through, and I can't shoot a longbow because the wall here is too high. What this is useful for is shooting at longer distance from further back. So here, at least, to defend the walls, you had to use other means.
The other means were recently investigated by a group of scientists and historians at White Castle, largely built in the early 13th century by the greatest English castle builder since the Normans, King Edward I, as part of his long and ruthless campaign to subdue Wales.
It was built or rebuilt by Edward I as the Lord Edward. He was an experienced crusader. He'd obviously tracked the development of castles in the Holy Land, which were the most sophisticated, and brought these ideas home.
Here, the walls are themselves defended by a series of strongholds, protruding round towers, set at intervals along their length, each in sight of at least 2 others.
White Castle represents an enormous investment in money. One of the reasons a king would do it is to reduce the size or numbers of the soldiers he needs to defend an area. Typically, castle garrisons were very small. One Welsh castle had a garrison of 11 and successfully defended itself against the armies of Owain Glyndŵr, the Welsh prince.
A new feature, arrow loops were set into the wall tower so archers could cover the ground right up to the walls and shoot with pinpoint accuracy. This was the field of fire, and any attacker within it was in danger of being killed instantly.
We've been able to demonstrate that the coverage offered by the arrow slits offers almost the whole area around it as a beaten zone. In other words, if you move within 150 yards, say, of the castle, you can be shot at from one of those arrow slits.
The attacking crossbowmen and longbowmen realize their chances of hitting a defender is near impossible. Their arrows, even at close range, rarely penetrate the tiny arrow slits in the castle wall. The defenders, however, shooting from inside the castle, have time to aim and shoot accurately. Several archers, shooting from protected positions by their arrow loops, would take a heavy toll on any army advancing on the castle. The defenders can see and shoot out, although it still takes practiced skill to shoot through these narrow arrow loops.
Well, almost uniquely in Great Britain, they have these displaced traverse slots. That's the cross pieces.
Until recently, experts had not understood why the arrow loops had these cross pieces.
As it turned out, the industrial psychologist explained why. It gives no clear aim point. So as the archer draws the arrow back, he has no clear position to aim at. Does he aim at the top one or the bottom one? And in that moment, with sort of interaction between the mind and body, he very often fluffs it. So it's actually quite a good psychological trick.
With the defending garrison having so many military advantages, secure behind their high and impenetrable stone walls, the attackers were forced to look for new and different strategies to defeat the seemingly impregnable fortifications. They had to look far back into history to find something to help them. Caerphilly Castle was built in only 3 years. This very short timescale reflects the powerful military and political threats that led to its construction in the first place. The castle was besieged 3 times but never taken. Sophisticated defenses like these posed difficult problems for an attacking army.
Basically, the attacker had two options. He could try to get into the castle by guile, by stealth, to actually get in before the defenders were ready for him. But very often this didn't work, and he had no option but to mount a formal siege. And for much of history, the siege was actually far more common than the battle in open field.
Military domination in the Middle Ages revolved around castles. Whoever controlled the castle controlled the area. Castles presented a continuing threat, which is why there were so many attacks on them. But attackers needed patience, as these assaults were very time-consuming. Edward I besieged one Scottish town for 3 months, and one Welsh town was besieged for 7 years. Even with weapons specially developed for siege warfare, progress was often slow. The ballista is a big, powerful crossbow. It could hurl spears, stones, or burning arrows at defenders on the walls, or those who tried to leave the castle. Operating a ballista needed a brave crew. Its limited range meant it had to be placed dangerously close to the castle walls, while those in the castle could easily pick off the engineers loading and shooting the machine with their bows and crossbows. At one siege in France in 1346, the ballista engineers seriously miscalculated the strength of the castle they were attacking. Having set up their machines outside the castle walls in the rain, and having had some success, they watched amazed as their expensive machines were smashed to bits by the more powerful and protected ballistas on the castle wall. An attacker needed other strategies.
He'd try to bite his way into the fortress bit by bit. He'd use battering rams against the gates. He'd use siege towers. These were huge wooden gantries covered with rawhide to make them fireproof. And they could come up close to the wall, either to let archers shoot into the body of the fortress or to let infantry attack. Finally, if he could get under the moat, he'd use mining. And to mine a fortress, you dug tunnels under the walls and under the keep and propped them up with wooden props. Eventually you set fire to the props, and as they burnt, so walls and towers collapsed. In 1224, some rebels held Bedford Castle against King Henry III. They held it for 6 months against the assembled might of the whole kingdom, and only when the keep was undermined, its walls cracked, and smoke billowing into the rooms, did the garrison eventually surrender. They'd fought so well and so hard that the king had no sympathy for them at all. Their leaders were hanged.
The biggest, mightiest, and most cumbersome siege engine of them all needed a highly trained team to operate it. This was the besieger's principal artillery weapon, which had, alongside its primary role of hurling heavy stones at the castle walls, a number of other astonishing uses. Taking a castle by force was quicker and cheaper than a prolonged siege. Commanders placed considerable faith in any machine that would achieve a speedy victory.
This siege engine is called a trebuchet. They were invented by the Chinese originally, and the technology was brought back by the Crusaders from the Middle East. It's made from oak. It's probably about as accurate as it's possible to get. No original siege engines still exist. So in reconstructing this, the only sort of evidence we had to go on was manuscript drawings and illustrations. There was a chap called Conrad Kaiser who wrote a book called The Bella Fortis, and his illustrations were particularly good.
Often trebuchets had to be transported from siege to siege. It was too expensive to build a new one each time a siege was undertaken. But there was a lot to move. At the siege of Dristlin Castle came 20 horsemen, 410 foot soldiers, 60 oxen pulling wheeled wagons, 35 pack horses carrying 480 stones of ammunition to the siege. The siege lasted 28 days, and was apparently so enthusiastically carried out that several of the defending knights were injured when part of the castle wall unexpectedly fell on top of them after a good hit from the trebuchet. Such accuracy and power was a tribute to the skills of the civilian engineers who built and usually operated these machines. Edward I was so proud of his trebuchet, Warwolf, that he built a special platform so the Queen and her ladies could watch as it pounded the walls of the town of Stirling, Scotland, in 1304.
Well, the most important person was the engineer. Now, he would have known where sieges were going on and travelled to the siege and offered his services to the captain or whoever was attacking the castle. He would have then employed large numbers of carpenters and blacksmiths who would have worked under his instruction, and these engines would have been built in situ outside the castle or the town that was being besieged.
Reports of wall-breaking siege machines were often written after the event and possibly exaggerated the scale of the trebuchet's success. Usually it chipped away at defences rather than dramatically demolishing them. Great care was taken with the preparation of the stone missiles, so they caused damage on impact when they shattered on the walls of the castle. Medieval besiegers were convinced that the best way to fight stone was with stone. And the bigger and better the stone missile, the better its chance of destroying the defender's walls.
Medieval people knew about aerodynamics, and they went to great lengths to chip out lovely round balls. Large numbers of masons would have followed the crews of these engines, preparing shot for them. If they couldn't get hold of that, then the next best thing was to take stone-washed boulders from beaches or riverbeds, which had nice smooth edges so that they flew better. And also, in some instances, they used the heads of their enemies, rotting entrails of animals, sacks of dung, anything. I mean, these things were used to spread disease within the garrisons.
Indeed, since the time of Greece and Rome, siege engines had been used for germ warfare.
We've experimented quite a lot with these engines, and we've looked at the trajectories of the missiles, and I've come to the conclusion myself that they weren't that effective at knocking down the walls.
But historical evidence suggests some were very effective, and castle builders certainly went to great lengths to keep them at a distance. They were very accurate, and when they hit the same place on a wall over and over again, they could cause considerable damage. But a determined garrison was usually hard to defeat, and this is the key to understanding why the medieval siege was so protracted. There was only one certain way for the attackers to be sure of winning, and this method could take a great deal of time. However, the defeat of the castle was inevitable unless outside help came.
Usually castles were well provisioned, but inevitably food ran short as time went on, and the garrison got hungrier and hungrier. They'd try to send out from the castle what were called useless mouths, women, children perhaps, who would eat food but not contribute to the defense. And sometimes the attacker would compound matters by simply not letting them out, thus to make the garrison even hungrier.
When food supplies ran out, slow starvation affected civilian men, women, and children. Their fate was no different from the soldiers. The attackers made no distinction. They would starve or die of disease.
Have you any idea what it's like inside a besieged town? At the beginning of the siege, the brave soldiers vowed, "Before we yield, we will drink our own urine and gnaw our fingers to the bone." Fine words. Soon these brave hearts were chasing dogs through the streets and eating them. Their horses soon went the same way. By the end, the daily ration was 7 ounces of bread made from malt, oats, and seawater. Most found it so distasteful that they chose to eat their rancid horse and dog meat without it.
But breaking the castle stronghold without waiting to slowly starve the inhabitants out seemed to become possible with the emergence of gunpowder weapons in the 14th century. They marked the beginning of the end of the powerful lord in his highly fortified castle. Perhaps a chemical compound, gunpowder, first used in China, and the new wonder weapon, the gun, and later the cannon that came with it would finally give the castle's attackers the technological breakthrough, the edge they had long been waiting for. Siege warfare did not change overnight with the arrival of firearms, but the appearance of gunpowder and the handgun in the Middle Ages gradually changed the way castles were designed.
In its infancy in the 14th century, the gun was a very crude and ineffective instrument. and designers simply made small holes in the walls of castles in which they could push these very primitive instruments out and fire. But during the 15th century, guns became heavier and more accurate. And here at the Tower of London, you see a wedge-shaped tower that was quite specifically designed for guns, probably built in the 1470s at a time when the Tower of London was bombarded from across the river by heavy cannon. You can see at different points in this tower openings. The small square ones are designed for cannon that were mounted on simple wooden beds, and the round holes higher up are in fact for handguns.
This then is an example of an old castle adapting to new technology but carrying on as before.
As crude as these features are, they do represent a major change in the way that defences were being designed.
But it was the big gun, the cannon, not the little handgun, that would force fortifications to change, but only slowly.
By the 16th century, castles were being built to house cannon. Henry VIII's fortresses on the south coast of England, with their great round drum gun towers, are fine examples.
Henry VIII's engineers developed a completely new type of fortification, for and against artillery. There's no romance or mystery with these designs. They are practical solutions. They absorb artillery fire and hit back hard with their own powerful cannon. But they were still based on the medieval castle-building traditions. We tested this replica 16th century cannon, loaded with a heavy stone ball, to see the effect that early artillery had on a stone wall. The thick stone wall is hit very hard, but the massive earthworks built up directly behind the wall absorb the impact. It is this combination of stone and banked earth that enabled so many medieval castles to withstand attack from siege engines and later artillery. Firing a large cannon at close range didn't bring the walls tumbling down.
Well, we can see from the stone shot must have struck about here. You can see the scarring, and it's caused a great spall of stonework to fall away, and it's opened cracks in the stonework for quite a distance around. Here's quite a loose piece. And it's now mixed, the ball is completely shattered, and there's tiny fragments of it now mixed with the stone from the wall. It's very difficult to work out which bit is which. But it's certainly shattered the stonework, and this is a massive earth emplacement. There's a huge amount of earth straight behind this, so the impact was colossal.
So despite the colossal impact, the wall survives. The test explains why there are frequent references to artillery attacks on ancient fortifications either failing completely or taking a considerable time to break down the castle's defences. This early medieval castle withstood the combined force of 9 pieces of heavy artillery during a major 6-week siege in the 17th century. 100 attackers lost their lives. The castle, left in the charge of Lady Banks, whose husband was away, lost 2. The best artillery of its day had failed to take the castle.
Soon, too, they were being built to resist cannon. And instead of high walls and round towers, we see a geometrical outline with the bastion, which is an arrow-shaped gun platform driven out from the main wall as the characteristic feature of artillery fortification. Europe is still littered with fortresses. Many of them from above look like stranded starfish. A lot of the work of the great French fortress engineer, Sébastien de Vauban.
Sébastien de Vauban was a French engineering genius. He remodeled defensive fortifications to deal with the threat of increasingly powerful and accurate artillery. He built and modified over 160 fortifications. When he died in 1707, he was regarded as the father of military engineering. French citizens felt safe behind the complex, interlinking arrow-sharp structures that Vauban had built to protect them. Vauban had calculated that it took 10 besiegers to 1 defender to be certain of success. So he built, knowing it would need a very large and expensive force to overcome one of his defended cities, and a great deal of time and patience too. The sharp-pointed brick bastions jutting out into the landscape had been designed to deflect the attackers' artillery fire. From inside the city, defenders could easily counterattack with their own artillery weapons and fire on the enemy from a bewildering number of angles. Each position could give concentrated supporting fire to the next angled position, and so on all around the city. Curiously, Vauban was as concerned with providing defense as he was with ensuring successful attacks. He proposed ways of taking fortresses which would burn gunpowder and spill less blood. Convinced that fortifications could be breached, artillery makers continued to increase the size and capability of their weapons. It was argued that sieges would be quickly ended if enough explosive force could be brought to bear on the target. But manufacturers were unable to build the gun to deliver it. This mortar was probably as near as the middle 19th century got to producing the ultimate devastating weapon. The mortar weighed around 7.5 tons and carried a charge of 120 pounds of gunpowder, enough to throw a 3,000-pound missile 1.5 miles. The Crimean War was fought in the middle of the 19th century. France and Britain were fighting alongside each other against Russia. The most powerful European artillery of its day had been sent to the Crimea and was ranged against the fortified town of Sebastopol, the Black Sea base of the Grand Russian Navy. French and British commanders had expected the attack to be over in a couple of days, but they had seriously underestimated the strength and resilience of the Russian base.
At the siege of Sevastopol, the biggest and best modern artillery proved inadequate against the stone and the earth defences of the city. In the end, it took 11 months of bombardment, 10,000 tons of British shot and shell, and 1.2 million rounds of French shot and shell to bring the city to its knees. Small wonder that early artillery often found it difficult to break down the stone and earth defences of medieval castles.
So medieval castles and modern defences could survive attack from modern artillery. But cannon were becoming more powerful and more long-ranged. Protecting towns meant building the defences further out. This was the lesson learned from Sebastopol. As a result, 5 huge forts were built to defend the home of the British Navy well away from the harbour. They cost so much they came to be known as Palmerston's Follies. On the south coast of England, the city of Portsmouth was home to the British Navy, a navy that controlled a vast empire in the last century. In the 1860s, the then British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston was terrified that the French, despite the fact they were allies only a few years previously, would attack his highly prized navy. So he built what were to become known as Palmerston's Follies, a hugely expensive line of fortifications along the ridge above the harbour. The chain of 5 forts with all the latest military innovations was considered strong enough to withstand the most concentrated attack.
If we look back at the Victorian period, greatest empire the world had ever known at that time, why were they so worried about defending the coasts of Britain? We had an empire that was worldwide, had the best navy in the world. And what seems to be the case was that there was a kind of crisis of confidence in the collective mind, that the British, with this great empire, were still frightened of the old enemy France, maybe making a dash across the Channel with their new steam-powered warships. It was considered necessary to spend millions of pounds on defending the whole area, not just around the dockyard, but out in the Solent with the sea forts.
The designers of these fortifications, which include Fort Nelson, were confident they could build forts strong enough to withstand the best modern artillery. The argument about what was best, the strongest offense or the strongest defense, was still raging 4,000 years after it had first begun.
Fortress architecture was always part of a duel between attack and defense. As artillery got better and gained longer range, engineers had to build their fortresses further out from the towns they defended. And fortresses themselves changed. Guns were protected in armoured steel turrets or behind concrete walls. And engineers increasingly dug down to shelter garrison, stores and ammunition beneath the protective earth.
The engineers sank most of Fort Nelson deep into the earth. Here were the ammunition dumps and gunpowder stores sufficient to withstand the attack of a whole French army, safe and secure in caverns hewn from the rock of the hillside. Fort Nelson is now the Royal Armoury's Artillery Museum. It and its neighbours are the largest and last specially built fortifications of any scale in Britain, and are a tribute to the Victorian men who designed and built them.
The Royal Engineers were a professional body in the British Army, very highly trained, and they didn't just build fortifications. For example, they designed the Royal Albert Hall, the great concert hall in London, and built churches and barracks and prisons all over the British Empire. At Fort Nelson, they had the rare opportunity, along with the neighbouring forts, of designing modern European fortifications. If you like, the shape, a kind of blunt polygonal shape, was aimed at the enemy. It was a kind of detached bastion of the old-fashioned kind. And then the sort of blunt arrowhead to the field of battle, if you like, is allowing you to take your battle towards the enemy. You're allowing your main armament to fire out and destroy an enemy before he could mount his field fortifications.
Fort Nelson's main defences faced inland to defend Portsmouth from attack from the land. It is like a tower in a castle wall, because the 5 forts used their guns rather than walls to protect and cover the areas between them.
You could leave out the joining walls by covering the gap between the forts with crossfire, so the forts were mutually dependent.
Concentrated artillery crossfire was supposed to destroy any attacker who entered the field of fire, each fort supporting its neighbour.
When it was built in the 1860s, Fort Nelson looked back into history, but forward into the 20th century. Its geometrical outline and deep ditches wouldn't have surprised an 18th century engineer. But its main defences, rising above the ramparts in protected emplacements called casemates, were rifled, breech-loading guns. Their range, rate of fire and accuracy would have astonished old Vauban.
The new Armstrong gun was rifled, powerful and accurate, capable of firing a 110-pound shell over 8,000 yards.
Artillery fortification was reaching a new maturity.
The gun was mounted on a carriage which could be turned and aimed at a particular target easily. The exact range of every geographical feature on the landscape beyond the fortress walls was recorded by the gunners. The idea was that attackers would be killed before their own guns were in position. The huge guns mounted on the banks dominated the surrounding area. Secure in their protected casemates, the gunners were able to fire rapidly and accurately on any attacker. Safely concealed deep within Fort Nelson are batteries for powerful mortars weighing over 4 tons. Each mortar is angled at 45 degrees and is designed to fire a 13-inch shell over 2 miles. Even though the fort was armed with the most modern artillery in the world and boasted the most sophisticated brick and earth defences, all designed to see off a threatened French invasion, it shared with medieval castles an interesting characteristic. Fort Nelson was manned by a very small number of people.
Britain had a problem in the 19th century, had a very large empire and a very small army. So fortifications could bolster a small army or a weak force.
Fort Nelson's role, along with the other forts in the chain, was to defend the home of the Royal Navy, Portsmouth Harbour. This was a considerable responsibility for the people manning the forts.
Most of the people who would have been here if there had been a real invasion would have been local shopkeepers, tradesmen, people like that, who, as a kind of annual holiday, would have a training session manning the guns. They were allowed very, very little ammunition, so most of the time they would have spent cleaning the guns and doing gun drill.
Fort Nelson was affectionately known as one of Palmerston's follies because it cost the British taxpayer so much money to build and equip, and it was never tested. The Prime Minister who had ordered the building of the forts and who proudly visited the construction work on his horse considered them his triumph. It is almost impossible now to assess whether any of them would have stood up to a concentrated artillery attack. The chances are that they would, because they were so well constructed and armed. The engineers had taken great care in their design, and they had drawn inspiration from the ancient castle builders of the past. Thousands of years ago, the builders of Maiden Castle understood that earth was strong. The 19th century engineers at Fort Nelson dug deep and used millions of bricks in its construction, but they also knew that earth offered a strong defense, especially against artillery.
Maiden Castle has a fantastic system of ditches and banks, and it's intriguing to find at Fort Nelson that the most obvious feature is a massive earth rampart. And in one sense, they're very much doing the same thing. They're allowing the defender a bit of height over the enemy, enhancing the natural position, the lie of the land, to allow the defenders to hopefully defeat the attackers.
Perhaps Fort Nelson did win one key battle in the fight to beat off the threat of a French naval invasion.
Fort Nelson could be said to have been an immense success along with its neighbours in the chain around Portsmouth because, of course, there was no French invasion. However, looking at it from the other point of view, by the time these forts were built in the late 1860s, France was defeated by Prussia or Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, so clearly was no longer a threat. It took quite a period of many years before we realised in this country that, in fact, France was no longer the enemy.
Fortifications didn't end with the completion of Fort Nelson in the 19th century. Strong, fixed defenses have been constructed in the 20th century, but fortifications have found it increasingly difficult to match more and more powerful weapons. In Vietnam, defenders went deep underground in a series of complex tunnels and passages that were difficult to defeat. In the Gulf War, stealth fighters pinpointed Iraqi steel and reinforced concrete bunkers and blew these fortifications clean out of the ground. The ingenuity of the defender to outwit the attacker with impregnable fortifications is only matched by the attacker's determination to break down these defenses. Neither side will give way. Neither side has ever given way. And so the constant battle between them continues.